"Careful near the car, sweetheart," Richard Holloway said with a smirk that made several guests laugh into their champagne glasses. "Your salary probably couldn't afford the tires." The laughter echoed across the marble showroom floor of Aston Martin Manhattan, sharp and polished like everything else inside the building. But what none of them realized in that moment was that the quiet cleaner standing beside the million-dollar Valkyrie was only minutes away from humiliating every powerful person in that room without raising her voice once. The Friday night unveiling event had drawn some of the wealthiest people in New York City. Wall Street investors, luxury influencers, celebrity athletes, and old money executives filled the glowing showroom beneath crystal lighting and giant digital screens displaying the Aston Martin logo in silver against black velvet walls. Outside, cold rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, while rows of imported supercars gleamed under carefully positioned lights worth more than most people's yearly salaries. Every inch of the place smelled like leather, cologne, and expensive ambition. Claire Bennett moved quietly through the crowd wearing a gray, cleaning uniform with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her white sneakers were worn at the edges, and her blonde hair was tied back into a low ponytail that revealed almost no makeup and tired blue eyes. She kept her gaze lowered as she cleaned fingerprints from the glass barrier surrounding the Aston Martin Valkyrie centerpiece. To everyone else in the room, she was invisible. Or worse, she was the kind of person rich people noticed only when they wanted something cleaned. Richard Holloway adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit as he admired his reflection in the side panel of the black Valkyrie. At 48, Richard carried the polished confidence of a man who had spent most of his life believing wealth made him smarter than everyone else. His silver watch flashed under the showroom lights as several guests gathered around him laughing at stories about private auctions and European vacations. "This beauty costs $3.2 million, Richard announced, loudly, running a hand along the roofline of the car. "Not exactly something you'll ever see parked outside a Walmart." A few guests chuckled obediently. Then his eyes landed on Claire. She had stepped closer to wipe a faint smudge from the rear glass panel. Richard's smile widened. "Easy there," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "One scratch and they'll garnish your paycheck for the next 100 years. More laughter followed. Claire paused only briefly before continuing her work. Her expression never changed. That somehow irritated Richard even more. Men like him preferred visible embarrassment. Silence made them uncomfortable. "Actually," Claire said softly without looking up, "the carbon fiber finish on this model is more durable than people think." Richard blinked in amusement. "Oh, we've got an expert now?" Several guests turned toward her. A younger salesman near the champagne table smirked openly. Claire calmly folded the cloth in her hand. "I just know this particular finish reacts differently under heat." Richard laughed harder this time. "That's adorable." The crowd joined him. "The cleaner thinks she understands a Valkyrie." Claire lowered her eyes again and stepped back. But as she moved, something slipped from the pocket of her cleaning cart and landed softly against the marble floor. A silver keychain. Tiny, worn, elegant. One of the nearby influencers wrinkled her nose. "That thing looks ancient." Richard glanced down dismissively. "Probably from some fake online collector store." Claire quickly bent down and picked it up before anyone could touch it. For just half a second, the overhead light reflected against the engraved silver wings symbol carved into the metal. An older man near the bar noticed it immediately. His smile faded slightly. But before he could say anything, loud applause suddenly erupted near the stage area. The event host stepped forward with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced proudly, "in just a few moments, we will officially unveil the Aston Martin Valkyrie Hypersport Edition." The crowd shifted excitedly. Camera phones lifted into the air. Influencers repositioned themselves for livestream angles while waiters carried fresh trays of champagne through the showroom. Richard gave Claire one final glance before turning away. "Try not to breathe on it too much," he muttered. Claire said nothing. She simply slipped the silver keychain back into her pocket and quietly returned to cleaning the glass. But as she looked toward the Valkyrie, something in her expression changed for the briefest moment. Not admiration, not envy, recognition. Almost like someone looking at an old memory hidden beneath layers of noise and arrogance. Across the showroom floor, the giant digital countdown reached 10 seconds. The crowd began counting down together. 9, 8, 7. The lights dimmed dramatically. 6, 5, 4. Richard Holloway smiled proudly beside the car, already imagining headlines and investment conversations. 3, 2, 1. The showroom exploded with applause as the black silk cover lifted into the ceiling, revealing the gleaming Aston Martin Valkyrie beneath white spotlights and roaring music. Then the host reached for the ignition control to start the vehicle in front of the live stream audience. He pressed the button once. Nothing happened. The music awkwardly continued playing. The host blinked. He pressed it again. Silence. A nervous murmur spread through the crowd. Richard's confident smile slowly disappeared. The atmosphere inside the showroom had changed completely. Just 15 minutes earlier, the unveiling event had been filled with polished laughter, camera flashes, and expensive confidence. Now tension moved quietly through the crowd like invisible smoke. Guests whispered behind champagne glasses while the Aston Martin Valkyrie sat motionless beneath the white showroom lights, beautiful and silent like a statue refusing to obey the people around it. Richard Holloway paced beside the vehicle with growing frustration written across his face. His polished image was beginning to crack under the pressure of hundreds of watching eyes. Near the back of the showroom, 2 security guards had subtly repositioned themselves closer to the car after overhearing the strange exchange between Claire Bennett and the technicians. One of them glanced toward Claire with suspicion, clearly wondering why a cleaner seemed to know more about the vehicle than the professionals hired to present it. "This is embarrassing," whispered a wealthy guest wearing a cream-colored designer coat. "How does a company like this allow something like this to happen during a live event?" Beside her, another man adjusted his gold cufflinks and muttered quietly, "Probably rushed the setup. Or hired cheap staff." His eyes drifted toward Claire for a second before returning to the stalled car. The implication hung heavily in the air. Claire remained near her cleaning cart, calm and composed while the chaos around her slowly intensified. The bright showroom lights reflected softly against the glass wall behind her, outlining the simple gray fabric of her uniform against a sea of black tuxedos and luxury gowns. She looked entirely out of place in that room, and yet somehow she appeared calmer than anyone else there. One of the younger waiters accidentally bumped into her shoulder while rushing past with a tray of champagne. "Sorry," he whispered nervously. Claire gave him a small, reassuring nod. "You are fine." Nearby, Richard's younger brother Daniel Holloway stepped forward from the crowd. Unlike Richard, Daniel carried himself with quieter energy. His dark suit was less flashy, his expression less arrogant. But even he looked uncomfortable now. "Maybe we should delay the unveiling," Daniel suggested carefully under his breath. Richard immediately snapped back, "Absolutely not." Several guests overheard him. "Do you realize how many investors are watching this live stream?" Richard hissed. "This car starts tonight." The older technician cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we may need authorization directly from the factory system." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "You are telling me a $3 million vehicle cannot be started at its own unveiling?" No one answered. The silence itself became humiliating. Across the room, an older woman wearing pearl earrings folded her arms while observing Claire carefully. "That cleaner," she murmured quietly to her companion. "She has not looked surprised once." Her companion frowned. "What? Everyone else is panicking. She is not." Claire slowly stepped closer toward the Valkyrie again, though she kept a respectful distance from the technicians. Her eyes studied the dashboard for several long seconds. Then, very gently, she rested her fingertips against the glass barrier surrounding the car. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just a small movement. But the younger technician noticed immediately. So did Daniel Holloway. Claire tilted her head slightly, as if listening for something only she understood. Then she asked one calm question. "Did anyone manually interrupt the startup sequence after the reset?" The younger technician blinked. "How did you know there was a reset?" Richard exhaled sharply in irritation. "Can somebody please explain why we are still entertaining this?" he demanded loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "She cleans windows." A few uncomfortable laughs followed, though weaker than before. Richard stepped closer to Claire now, lowering his voice into something smoother but colder. "Miss Bennett, I appreciate enthusiasm. Truly. But this is not one of those inspirational internet stories where the janitor secretly saves the day." Several wealthy guests smiled faintly at the comment. "You should probably return to your work." Claire met his eyes for the first time that evening. Her expression remained perfectly calm. I was only trying to help. Richard gave a thin smile. And I am trying to avoid further embarrassment. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Around them, the showroom seemed quieter now. Even the music felt distant. Claire slowly lowered her gaze again. Then, without responding emotionally, she reached into the pocket of her gray jacket and pulled out her old silver keychain once more. This time she turned it carefully between her fingers while staring toward the Valkyrie. The younger technician's face changed again the moment he saw the engraved initials under the silver wing symbol. "Wait," he whispered under his breath. Daniel Holloway noticed his reaction immediately. "What is it?" The technician hesitated. "That engraving," he swallowed hard. "I have only seen that symbol once before." Richard looked annoyed. Enough with the mystery. But before anyone could continue, Claire quietly took out her phone and made a brief call. The room watched her with growing curiosity. "Hello," she said softly. "Yes. I think they still have not fixed the startup authorization." A pause. Claire glanced toward the stalled Valkyrie. "No, I have not touched it yet." Richard stared at her in disbelief. "Who exactly are you calling?" Claire calmly slipped the phone back into her pocket. "Someone who might want to know the unveiling is having problems." Richard let out a dry laugh. Unbelievable. But the younger technician no longer looked amused. In fact, he had gone pale. Because suddenly he remembered exactly where he had seen that silver engraving before. Not online. Not in magazines. Inside a confidential engineering presentation from Aston Martin headquarters 3 years earlier. A presentation connected to only one person. The tension inside the showroom had become impossible to ignore. Conversations no longer sounded relaxed. Wealthy guests who had arrived expecting luxury entertainment now stood in uneasy clusters whispering behind champagne glasses while cameras continued recording the stalled unveiling. The black Aston Martin Valkyrie remained frozen beneath the white lights, silent and motionless despite the frantic efforts surrounding it. Every passing minute deepened the embarrassment hanging over the event like heavy fog. Richard Holloway's patience was beginning to disappear completely. His jaw tightened as another technician stepped away from the vehicle, shaking his head in frustration. Across social media, livestream comments were already flooding in faster than the event moderators could delete them. "This is becoming a disaster," Daniel Holloway muttered quietly beside his brother. Richard ignored him. His attention had shifted entirely toward Claire Bennett. The calmness in her expression irritated him more with every passing second. She did not look nervous. She did not look intimidated. Even after being laughed at repeatedly in front of dozens of wealthy guests, she remained composed beside her cleaning cart, like someone waiting for a moment nobody else understood yet. That quiet confidence had started making people uncomfortable. "Sir," one of the security guards said carefully as he approached Richard, "some guests are asking questions about the delay." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. Then his eyes moved toward Claire again. "This entire situation has become distracting," he said coldly. Several nearby guests turned to listen immediately. Claire looked up calmly. Richard straightened the sleeve of his expensive suit before continuing. "Miss Bennett, I think it would be best if you return to the service area for the rest of the evening." The words sounded polite on the surface, but everyone in the room understood what he really meant. A few guests exchanged awkward glances. Others simply watched in silence. Claire remained still for a moment. "You want me to leave?" she asked quietly. Richard gave a thin smile. "I want this event to remain professional." One of the women standing nearby softly laughed into her champagne glass. "Honestly," she whispered to her friend, "it is getting strange having staff members involved in technical discussions." Her friend nodded while looking at Claire's faded sneakers. She clearly does not belong in the middle of all this. The comments spread quietly through the crowd. Not cruel enough to sound openly hateful, but cold enough to isolate her completely. Claire slowly lowered her gaze toward the marble floor. The overhead lights reflected against the silver keychain still resting loosely in her hand. Nearby, the younger technician watched nervously as if he wanted to say something, but could not decide whether he should. Richard noticed the hesitation immediately. "Do we have another problem?" he asked sharply. The technician hesitated. "No, sir." Richard nodded once. "Good." Then he looked back at Claire. "Tonight is an important night for serious clients, investors, and media partners. I am sure you understand this environment may feel overwhelming." Claire said nothing. Richard continued speaking smoothly, every word carefully polished for the audience around him. There are places where expertise matters, and there are places where people simply need to know their role. The room fell strangely quiet after that sentence. Even some guests who had laughed earlier now looked uncomfortable. Daniel Holloway frowned slightly. Richard. But Richard was too irritated to stop now. You have done your job, he told Claire. Thank you. Security can escort you to the employee entrance. One of the guards shifted awkwardly beside her, but did not move immediately. Claire looked toward the stalled Valkyrie one more time. Then, very calmly, she asked a single question. Did anyone check the secondary authentication layer after the manual interruption? The younger technician's eyes widened instantly. The older technician froze completely. Richard stared at her in disbelief. There she goes again. Claire gently slipped the silver keychain back into her pocket. The system locks itself after a broken startup sequence, she said softly. If someone forced the reset manually, the car will reject every standard authorization attempt. Several people in the crowd looked toward the technicians now. One of them quietly whispered, "Is that true?" The older technician swallowed hard, but did not answer. Richard noticed the reaction immediately, and his face darkened. Enough. His voice echoed more sharply through the showroom this time. I do not know what game this is, but I am done entertaining it. Claire met his eyes again with quiet steadiness. It is not a game. Richard stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. Then let me make this simple for you. This car costs more than most people in this city will earn in their lifetime. Men and women spend decades building the kind of success standing in this room tonight. His eyes moved deliberately over Claire's gray uniform. You cannot walk into a place like this dressed like that and expect people to believe you belong near something this valuable. The silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. Claire stood perfectly still. No anger crossed her face. No embarrassment either. Only patience. Then she said one sentence so quietly that the people nearest her had to lean in slightly to hear it. The people who built this car never cared what shoes I wore. The younger technician. Look pale now. Daniel Holloway slowly turned toward Claire with growing confusion. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, every screen inside the showroom suddenly flickered black for one brief second. Then the giant Aston Martin logo reappeared across the walls. Underneath it, new text flashed across the display system in silver letters. Authorization request detected. The entire showroom froze as the glowing silver words stretched across every digital screen in the building. Authorization request detected. Even the background music seemed quieter now beneath the sudden wave of confusion moving through the crowd. Guests slowly lowered their phones while technicians exchanged alarmed looks beside the motionless Valkyrie. Richard Holloway stared upward at the screens in disbelief. What is that supposed to mean? He demanded sharply. No one answered immediately. The younger technician quickly stepped toward his tablet, his hands suddenly unsteady. Lines of system information flashed across the display faster than he could process them. Beside him, the older technician leaned closer with visible concern. Someone triggered a legacy authorization request, the younger man whispered. From inside the local system. Richard looked irritated rather than worried. Then disable it. The younger technician swallowed hard. I do not think we can. Around the showroom, wealthy guests murmured nervously to one another. Several investors standing near the champagne bar no longer looked amused. One woman quietly asked, "Is this some kind of security issue?" Another guest lowered his voice. Who exactly has access to a system override on a prototype like this? Daniel Holloway slowly turned toward Claire Bennett again. She remained standing calmly beside her cleaning cart, her expression unchanged despite every eye in the room beginning to shift toward her. The gray fabric of her uniform looked almost painfully plain beneath the white luxury lighting. Yet somehow the silence around her now felt heavier than the polished authority Richard had relied on all evening. Claire gently folded her cleaning cloth one final time before placing it neatly on the cart handle. Such a small movement. Yet the room watched it like it mattered. Richard noticed that too. This is ridiculous, he said coldly, trying to regain control of the atmosphere. A technical glitch appears on a screen, and suddenly everyone starts staring at the cleaning staff. He forced a short laugh, though almost nobody joined him this time. The younger technician looked toward Claire carefully. Miss Bennett. He hesitated before speaking again. What exactly did you mean earlier about the secondary authentication layer? Claire's blue eyes moved briefly toward the stalled Valkyrie. The original startup architecture had a hidden recovery sequence, she answered softly. It was designed to protect the hybrid system if someone interrupted initialization manually. The older technician frowned deeply. How would you know that? Claire did not answer immediately. Her silence only deepened the tension. Nearby, one of the security guards quietly spoke into his earpiece after noticing the nervous behavior spreading among the technical staff. Across the room, the older woman with pearl earrings narrowed her eyes thoughtfully at Claire. Bennett, she murmured quietly to herself. Why does that name sound familiar? Daniel Holloway heard her and glanced toward Claire again. The younger technician suddenly looked back down at his tablet. Then his entire face changed. No way, he whispered under his breath. What? The older technician asked. The younger man slowly rotated the tablet screen toward him. A small line of text had appeared beneath the authorization warning. Legacy Design Access Request. B. Bennett. The older technician visibly stiffened. That cannot be possible. Richard immediately noticed their reaction. What now? The younger technician hesitated before answering. Sir, the system is recognizing someone with original design authorization credentials. Richard stared at him blankly. And those credentials were only assigned to senior development personnel connected to the Valkyrie program. A quiet murmur spread through the nearby guests again. Several people slowly looked back toward Claire. Richard let out an irritated breath. You are seriously suggesting our cleaner somehow hacked an Aston Martin system? Claire finally spoke again, her voice calm and measured. Nobody hacked anything. Richard turned sharply toward her. Then explain why your name just appeared inside the authorization software. Claire glanced briefly toward the giant digital screens still glowing silver above the showroom floor. Because the system remembers who built it. The words landed softly, but the silence afterward felt enormous. Daniel Holloway stared at her now with growing disbelief. The younger technician's pulse visibly raced as he looked again at the silver keychain partially visible in Claire's hand. The initials, he whispered quietly. BB. Richard shook his head immediately, refusing to let the atmosphere shift away from his control. This is absurd. Yet for the first time that evening, his confidence sounded forced instead of natural. One of the luxury bloggers filming nearby stepped closer. Excuse me, he asked carefully toward Claire. Are you connected to Aston Martin Engineering? Richard answered before she could speak. No, she is connected to a mop bucket. A few strained laughs followed, though now they sounded uncertain rather than cruel. Claire did not react emotionally. She only looked toward the stalled Valkyrie again, almost sadly. The startup lock will keep repeating until someone restores the original sequence order, she said quietly. Otherwise, the fuel synchronization system will reject every attempt. The younger technician stared at her like he was standing in front of a ghost. That explanation is exactly how the internal engineering memo described the failure scenario. Richard's face tightened slightly. Enough. But now even the crowd no longer seemed fully on his side. The older woman with pearl earrings slowly stepped closer toward Claire. Miss Bennett, she asked carefully, have we met before? Claire offered a small polite smile. No, ma'am. The woman studied her face more closely. Then her eyes widened very slightly. Wait. She looked toward Daniel Holloway. Robert Bennett, the engineer from Aston Martin Advanced Systems. Daniel frowned. The one who disappeared after the Valkyrie project? The woman nodded slowly without taking her eyes off Claire. That was his daughter's name. The room fell silent again. Richard Holloway did not say anything this time. But for the first time all night, uncertainty finally appeared in his eyes. The silence inside the showroom no longer felt awkward. It felt dangerous. Guests who had spent the evening casually sipping champagne now stood completely still beneath the glowing Aston Martin screens, watching the quiet cleaner at the center of the room with growing uncertainty. The silver words authorization request detected still glowed across the walls like a warning nobody fully understood yet. Richard Holloway could feel control slipping away from him inch by inch, and men like Richard never handled that feeling well. This has gone far enough, he said sharply, stepping forward before anyone else could speak. His polished voice cut through the room with practiced authority. I do not care whose daughter she is or what stories people suddenly want to invent. This woman is not part of tonight's event. Claire Bennett stood calmly beside her cleaning cart, one hand resting lightly against the handle. Her expression remained unreadable while dozens of wealthy eyes focused on her. Richard pointed toward the exit without even looking directly at her now. Escort her out. The two security guards hesitated. Daniel Holloway frowned immediately. Richard, maybe we should slow down for a second. No, Richard's voice hardened. We are standing in the middle of a public relations disaster because people are suddenly treating a maintenance employee like she belongs in a design meeting. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable looks. The younger technician looked pale now. Sir, with respect, I really think we should verify the authorization request first. Richard turned toward him sharply. Verify what exactly? The technician swallowed hard. The system is recognizing her credentials. A system malfunction is recognizing random information, Richard snapped back. That does not make her an engineer. Claire finally spoke again, her voice soft but steady. You should check the creator registry. The room went quiet after that sentence. Richard let out a humorless laugh. Creator registry? He shook his head slowly as if the entire situation had become absurd beyond reason. Do you understand how ridiculous this sounds? Claire did not respond emotionally. The registry will explain the authorization request. Richard stepped closer now, lowering his voice into something colder and more personal. Miss Bennett, I built relationships with executives for 20 years to stand in rooms like this. People earn access to this level of business through reputation, discipline, and credibility. His eyes moved deliberately across her plain gray uniform again, not through mysterious keychains and dramatic comments. The words hung heavily in the air. Nearby, several guests shifted uncomfortably. One woman quietly lowered her champagne glass altogether. Claire slowly reached into her pocket and removed the old silver keychain again. This time, instead of hiding it, she gently placed it on the black marble display table beside the stalled Valkyrie. The tiny silver wings reflected beneath the showroom lights. Everyone nearby leaned closer instinctively. The younger technician's breathing visibly changed. That is not a souvenir, he whispered. Daniel Holloway stared at the engraving. What exactly is it? The technician looked toward him carefully. That emblem was only issued to original Valkyrie development leads. A ripple of whispers moved instantly through the crowd. Richard's face tightened. Enough. But even he no longer sounded completely certain. Claire calmly looked toward the nearest technician. Check the system archive under Bennett authorization credentials. Richard immediately cut in. Do not touch anything else. Then he turned back toward Claire with growing irritation. You know what I think this is? He asked loudly enough for everyone to hear. I think you walked into a luxury event, realized there was confusion, and decided to play along because people here were too distracted to stop you. The accusation settled over the room like cold rain. Some guests looked shocked he had said it out loud. Others silently waited to see how Claire would react. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself emotionally. She only looked at Richard with calm blue eyes that somehow made his anger seem louder than it was. You still believe this is about access, she said quietly. Richard gave a thin smile. Because it is. Claire gently rested her fingertips against the silver keychain on the table. No, she answered softly. It is about recognition. The younger technician suddenly looked back at his tablet again. Then his eyes widened completely. Oh my God. Every head turned toward him instantly. Richard's patience finally snapped. What now? The technician slowly lifted the tablet with visibly shaking hands. On the screen was an archived engineering profile connected to the Valkyrie program. The image loading beside the profile was several years old, but unmistakable. Blonde hair, calm blue eyes. The same silver wings keychain hanging from a lanyard around her neck. Beneath the image was a name. Claire Bennett, original hybrid system architect. The entire showroom fell silent. One of the wealthy investors quietly whispered, "That cannot be real." Richard stared at the tablet for several long seconds without speaking. Then, almost desperately, he shook his head once. No, but before anyone could process the revelation fully, another voice suddenly echoed from the showroom entrance. Actually, the voice said calmly, "It is very real." Every person in the room turned toward the front doors at the exact same moment. The entire showroom turned toward the entrance in complete silence. Even the technicians standing beside the stalled Valkyrie seemed frozen beneath the white lights. The voice had come from a tall, silver-haired man stepping through the glass doors with measured confidence, his dark overcoat still carrying traces of rain from the Manhattan streets outside. Two executives followed closely behind him, both wearing Aston Martin corporate badges. The moment the older technicians saw him, their faces changed instantly. "Mr. Whitaker," one of them whispered under his breath. Charles Whitaker was not just another executive. He was the executive chairman of Aston Martin North America and one of the most influential figures connected to the Valkyrie program itself. Wealthy guests immediately straightened their posture as he entered the showroom. Richard Holloway's expression shifted from irritation to confusion. "Charles," Richard said quickly, forcing a smile back onto his face, "thank God you are here. We are dealing with some kind of misunderstanding involving the system." But Charles Whitaker barely looked at him. His eyes had already settled on Claire Bennett, standing quietly beside the display table, her gray cleaner's uniform still playing beneath the bright luxury lighting. For one long moment, the room held its breath. Then Charles walked directly toward her. "Miss Bennett," he said respectfully, "we have been trying to contact you for almost 2 hours." The silence that followed felt enormous. Richard's confident expression disappeared completely. Claire offered a small polite nod. "My phone was in my locker earlier." Charles glanced briefly toward the stalled Valkyrie before looking back at her. "The system locked exactly the way you predicted." Several guests visibly stiffened at those words. One of the investors near the champagne bar lowered his glass entirely. Richard looked between them in disbelief. "You know her?" Charles turned slowly toward him. "Know her?" There was genuine disbelief in his voice now. "Richard, Claire Bennett is the original hybrid systems architect behind the Valkyrie platform." The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody even whispered. Richard stared at Charles as if he had misheard him completely. "No," he said quietly. "That is not possible." Charles looked genuinely confused by the reaction around him. "The Bennett architecture is one of the most protected engineering systems Aston Martin has ever developed." His eyes shifted briefly toward Claire again, with obvious respect. Her work helped save the Valkyrie program from collapse 6 years ago. The younger technician looked almost relieved hearing someone finally confirm the truth aloud. Around the showroom, wealthy guests who had ignored Claire all evening now stared at her differently. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked stunned. Few influencers quietly lowered their cameras, suddenly aware they had spent the last hour recording themselves laughing at the wrong person. Richard's face had gone pale beneath the showroom lights. "But she is," he stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "A cleaner." The words never left his mouth, because suddenly he understood exactly how terrible they would sound now. Claire calmly picked up the silver keychain from the display table. Charles noticed it immediately and smiled faintly. "I cannot believe you still carry that." Claire looked down at the worn silver wings. "My father gave it to me the day the first prototype started successfully." The older woman with pearl earrings slowly covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel Holloway stared at Claire with open disbelief. "Your father was Robert Bennett." Claire nodded once. "He led the original Advanced Systems Division before he passed away." Charles folded his hands calmly in front of him. After his death, Claire finished the hybrid architecture herself, while most people in the company still doubted the system would even work. The silence deepened again. Richard Holloway could no longer meet Claire's eyes directly. Every cruel comment he had made throughout the evening now seemed to echo through the showroom louder than before. Claire had never interrupted him, never defended herself aggressively, never demanded respect. She had simply stood there quietly while everyone judged her by a gray uniform and worn sneakers. One of the investors finally spoke carefully. "If she designed the system, why is she working here tonight?" Claire answered before Charles could. "Because I asked to." Richard looked up sharply. Claire's voice remained calm and steady. "Aston Martin recently acquired a larger ownership position in this showroom group." Several guests exchanged confused looks immediately. Charles nodded once. "Miss Bennett became the lead private investor during the acquisition process." Another silence swept through the room. Richard looked like the ground beneath him had shifted completely. Daniel Holloway slowly turned toward his brother with disbelief written across his face. "You mean?" Charles answered him directly. "Claire Bennett now holds controlling ownership authority over Holloway Luxury Motors." The words landed like thunder inside the silent showroom. One of the security guards actually took a small step backward. The younger technician looked down immediately, almost embarrassed for ever doubting her. Richard stared at Claire speechlessly now. The woman he had mocked in front of investors, reporters, and guests all evening was not only the creator of the system sitting inside the Valkyrie. She was also the new majority owner connected to his entire dealership group. Claire finally stepped toward the stalled car for the first time that evening. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even breathed loudly. The crowd parted naturally as she approached the Valkyrie beneath the white lights. Her gray uniform still looked simple. Her sneakers were still worn at the edges. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Only the room's understanding had. Claire gently rested one hand against the driver's side door before looking calmly toward Richard. "You kept asking whether I belonged here," she said softly. "The truth is, I never left." No one in the showroom moved as Claire Bennett stood beside the Aston Martin Valkyrie with one hand resting lightly against the driver's side door. The white showroom lights reflected softly across the polished black carbon fiber, while dozens of wealthy guests stared at her with completely different eyes now. Just 30 minutes earlier, many of them had laughed quietly at her gray uniform, her worn sneakers, and the cleaning cart beside her. Now the room felt almost embarrassed by its own silence. Richard Holloway looked as though he had forgotten how to speak. His face had lost all the polished confidence that once filled the showroom so easily. Every sentence he had thrown at Claire throughout the evening seemed to hang invisibly in the air around him now. "Careful near the car. People like you do not belong here. Let the professionals handle it." The words sounded uglier in memory than they ever had out loud. Charles Whitaker stepped quietly beside the display platform while executives behind him exchanged tense looks. They seemed aware that everyone in the room had just witnessed something far bigger than a technical failure. This was no longer about a stalled vehicle. It was about character. Daniel Holloway slowly exhaled and rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Claire," he said carefully, "I had no idea." Claire looked toward him calmly. Most people did not. Her voice carried no bitterness. That somehow made the atmosphere even heavier. Nearby, the younger technician lowered his eyes. "I am sorry, Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "I should have realized sooner." Claire gave him a small nod. "You listen when others stopped listening. That matters." The young man looked visibly relieved by her response. Richard finally found his voice again, though it no longer carried the same certainty. "Miss Bennett." He paused awkwardly as several guests turned toward him immediately. Richard Holloway was a man deeply familiar with power. He knew how to negotiate contracts worth millions of dollars. He knew how to command rooms filled with investors. But in that moment, standing before the quiet woman he had publicly humiliated all evening, he looked smaller than anyone had ever seen him. "I owe you an apology," he said slowly. The room remained completely still. Claire watched him quietly without interrupting. Richard swallowed once before continuing. "I made assumptions about you based on..." His eyes briefly moved toward her simple uniform. "Based on appearances." One of the wealthy women who had mocked Claire earlier lowered her gaze into her champagne glass, suddenly unable to meet anyone's eyes. Several influencers quietly stopped recording altogether. Nobody wanted to become the face of the wrong side of this story. Claire looked toward Richard calmly. "You were not the only one." The honesty of her answer made several people visibly uncomfortable. Charles Whitaker folded his hands behind his back and glanced around the showroom. This company was built by engineers, mechanics, designers, and workers who cared more about excellence than status, he said firmly. Somewhere along the way, too many people started confusing luxury with superiority. His words settled across the silent showroom like a judgment no one could argue against. Richard looked genuinely ashamed now. "I was trying to protect the image of the event." Claire nodded slightly. "I know." Richard frowned softly, surprised by her calmness. "Then why did you not say who you were from the beginning?" Claire looked toward the Valkyrie again before answering. "Because if respect only appears after titles and ownership are mentioned, then it was never really respect." The room went completely silent after that. Even the distant sounds of rain against the showroom windows seemed louder now. One of the older investors slowly removed his glasses and shook his head quietly. "That might be the most expensive lesson this room has ever received." A few nervous laughs followed, but this time they carried humility instead of arrogance. Claire finally stepped fully beside the driver's side door. The technicians instinctively moved aside for her without being asked. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there anymore. She reached calmly toward the dashboard controls through the open window and pressed a precise sequence across the interface screen. The system lights immediately shifted from red to blue. Then, with smooth controlled power, the Aston Martin Valkyrie roared to life. The sound of the engine rolled across the marble showroom floor like distant thunder. Several guests gasped softly while cameras immediately lifted again throughout the room. But this time nobody was filming the car alone. They were filming Claire. She stepped back quietly as the engine settled into a perfect controlled idle beneath the bright white lights. No dramatic smile crossed her face. No arrogant speech followed. She simply stood there calmly in her gray cleaner's uniform while the most expensive vehicle in the room responded to her touch more naturally than it had responded to anyone else all night. Richard stared at the running Valkyrie for several long seconds before speaking again. "You came here dressed like that on purpose, did not you?" Claire looked at him with gentle honesty. "I came here exactly as I am." The answer hit harder than any insult could have. Around them, wealthy guests who once barely noticed her now watched with quiet reflection, because the truth standing in front of them was impossible to ignore anymore. The woman they dismissed because of her clothes had built the very technology they admired. The cleaner they tried to remove from the room owned the company they desperately wanted access to. And the quietest person in the showroom had turned out to be the one who understood dignity better than anyone else there. For several long moments after the Valkyrie engine came to life, nobody inside the showroom seemed capable of speaking. The deep, controlled rumble of the hybrid engine echoed softly across the marble floor, while white lights reflected against the polished black carbon fiber like liquid glass. The car that had humiliated an entire room full of executives and investors now sat perfectly obedient beneath Claire Bennett's calm hand. But strangely, the most powerful thing in the room was no longer the vehicle. It was the silence. Richard Holloway stood motionless beside the display platform, staring at the woman he had spent the entire evening underestimating. Around him, wealthy guests who once barely acknowledged Claire now looked at her with a mixture of embarrassment, admiration, and quiet reflection. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others seemed unable to stop watching her, because every polished assumption they walked into the showroom with had collapsed in less than an hour. Charles Whitaker stepped toward the center of the room and addressed the guests with composed professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "I believe tonight's unveiling finally has the right person standing beside the car." Soft laughter moved through the crowd this time, but it carried humility instead of cruelty. Claire gently stepped away from the Valkyrie and allowed the engine to continue idling behind her. She did not pose for cameras. She did not enjoy the attention. In fact, she almost seemed uncomfortable with it. One of the reporters near the front finally gathered enough courage to ask the question everyone else was thinking. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "why did you stay silent when people were disrespecting you?" The showroom grew still again. Claire looked toward the reporter thoughtfully before answering. "Because character becomes obvious when people think you have nothing to offer them." Several guests lowered their eyes immediately after hearing that. Richard inhaled slowly and stepped forward once more. The arrogance that once shaped every movement he made was gone now. "Claire," he said quietly, "I cannot undo the way I treated you tonight." She looked at him calmly. Richard glanced around the showroom, fully aware that every investor, customer, employee, and journalist was listening now. "But I can admit I was wrong." Claire studied him for a brief moment before nodding once. "That matters too." Daniel Holloway looked visibly relieved hearing her say it. The younger technician quietly smiled to himself while the older technician simply shook his head in disbelief at how quickly the evening had transformed. Nearby, one of the waiters who had apologized to Claire earlier stood watching her with genuine admiration. She noticed him and gave him a small warm smile that seemed to surprise him completely. Then Claire turned toward Charles Whitaker. "There is one thing I would like changed," she said softly. Charles nodded immediately. "Anything?" Claire looked around the showroom slowly, taking in the marble floors, the expensive suits, the security guards, the staff members standing quietly along the walls. No employee working in any location connected to this company should ever be treated as invisible again. The room went silent one final time. Not the cleaning staff, not the waiters, not the assistants. None of them. Her voice never rose, but every word landed with quiet force. Charles Whitaker nodded without hesitation. "Done." Richard looked down briefly, ashamed. Claire reached into her pocket and removed the old silver wings keychain once more. The tiny engraved metal reflected beneath the showroom lights exactly the way it had earlier that evening when everyone assumed it was worthless. She looked at it for a moment before gently placing it into the younger technician's hand. He looked stunned. "Miss Bennett," Claire smiled faintly. "You were the first person who actually listened." The young man stared at the keychain like it weighed far more than silver. Around them, several guests watched the exchange quietly, perhaps realizing for the first time that respect was not earned through wealth alone. Claire then walked calmly toward her cleaning cart, still standing near the glass wall where the evening had begun. The simple gray cloth remained folded neatly on the handle exactly where she left it. For one brief moment, she rested her hand on the cart before turning back toward the room. Richard Holloway looked at her carefully. "What happens now?" Claire glanced once toward the running Valkyrie, then toward the employees standing quietly along the edges of the showroom. "Now," she said softly. "Now we decide what kind of company this place becomes." No one spoke after that. Claire picked up her coat from the cart and calmly walked toward the front entrance while the entire showroom watched her in complete silence. The rain outside had finally stopped, leaving the Manhattan streets shining beneath the city lights. As the glass doors opened, the reflection of the Aston Martin logo shimmered behind her across the marble floor. Wealthy investors moved aside without being asked. Security guards straightened respectfully. Even Richard Holloway stepped back from her path. Claire paused briefly near the doorway and looked back one final time. "Luxury was never the car," she said quietly. "It was how people chose to treat each other when nobody important seemed to be watching." Then she walked out into the cool New York night, carrying nothing except her coat and her dignity, while behind her, in a silent showroom filled with expensive people and million-dollar machines, everyone finally understood what true value looked like.